Really thank everyone for being here today and for all of you on the phone. As we do every meeting, we're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right.
So I am going to start off the morning with asking Carol Mathis if she will do the roll call for the electronic meeting.
When I call your name, please indicate if you're present. Cedric Rucker. Shep Miller.
Here.
Jerry Stinson.
I'm having difficulty hearing. I am as well.
Okay, we'll start over. Thank you.
Jerry Stinson. Scott Kasperwitz.
Here.
John Malbin.
Here.
Dixon Whitworth.
It's probably was bugged in.
Here.
Mary Hines.
Here.
Stephen Johnson.
It is one.
Here.
Raymond Smoot.
Here.
Cedric Rucker.
Here.
That's our full quorum.
Wow, excellent. And we, I assume you will, oh, and Mr. Brown, hello, welcome. So I'm going to ask, for those of you on the phone, would you mind muting your lines? You know, until you wish to speak. Shep wants to speak.
It'd also be helpful to mute the live stream if you're on that, so that, because there's a delay in the live stream to the actual dial-in. So if they mute both the front and the live stream, it'd be good.
Okay, you stand there. How are you? Crazy new world. Shep, I just learned from the audiovisual folks that if you're watching the live stream, there will be a delay.
Yeah, that's fine, as long as if you mute the phone, it's sort of helpful, yeah.
He's talking about them doing it at their place.
Yes.
I'm not getting any video, I'm just getting video right now.
Okay, is the video started?
Video is what we're watching here currently.
Okay.
It is started.
Well, and for our first presentation, I'm not sure we actually have a formal presentation or any video that goes with it. This was intended originally to be part of the environmental task force, which has now been elevated to an environmental subcommittee that is going to be chaired by Deputy Commissioner Rob Cary to give us an update on Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, South Island, Fort Wool, and our partnership with Natural Resources. I will also just say that we have a special guest in having Deputy Secretary Josh Sachs with us today. And truly one of the major reasons I wanted this meeting to go forward. So with that, Deputy Commissioner, I turn it over to you. Good morning.
Good morning. I trust this mic is on. The light didn't come on. Anyway, good morning, Madam Secretary, members of the board, and those joining us remotely. Again, my name is Rob Cary. I'm the Chief Deputy Commissioner of VDOT, and I wanted to give an update on the colonial birds that traditionally have nested at the South Island and the Hampton Roads, and just start out at the highest level with a couple of common goals of the Secretary of Transportation and the Secretary of Natural Resources. Those two high-level goals being successfully providing the essential habitat needed for the well-being of the South Island marine colonial seabirds, and also while practicing a robust approach to environmental stewardship, completing the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel expansion project on time, on budget, and with high quality. So those are the two overarching goals that are driving us in this work with the birds and our tunnel project. I want to start out, the Secretary touched on it, by discussing a truly critical initiative that's happening right now that Secretary Valentine launched this month. We had the Environmental Task Force. She has elevated that to an environmental subcommittee. She did that brand new subcommittee, as I said, just this month. They have been a task force meeting before this, but to elevate it, I think, is critically important. Secretary Valentine has made it very clear that her goal in transportation is to develop and consistently implement the highest environmental standards without regard to any changes arising in federal law or its interpretation. The CTB's Environmental Subcommittee will focus on three broad areas: greenhouse gas management, climate resiliency, and then other best practices in environmental stewardship. Secretary Valentine, as she mentioned, had asked me to chair this subcommittee to ensure the Transportation Secretariat implements the best practices in environmental stewardship that are available to us. Now, relative to the birds, as you know, the South Island has traditionally been a significant nesting habitat for these marine colonial bird species. We have done extensive coordination between VDOT and Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, and between myself and the Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources, Josh Sachs. April is the beginning of the nesting season for these birds in Virginia. And as we were out there, I was on the island last Thursday and Friday with some of the representatives from the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, and they noted that they saw some scout birds, which are, and I'm not an ornithologist, but some birds that travel ahead that are sent out, then will come back. So they indicated that is definite proof that the birds are very close and coming in. So we're expecting them in the next couple of weeks for sure. We have done extensive preparatory work on the South Island. That's why I was out there on Thursday and Friday. We had crews out Thursday, Friday over the weekend just to ensure that the island, everything on the South Island, is supportive of what Josh will talk about in terms of what they're doing with an alternative nesting habitat. And we want to make sure that our habitat is supportive in getting these birds to go to the new habitat. This work also supports HRBT's construction project. While we're being very supportive of the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries efforts to provide an alternative nesting location, in doing that and encouraging them to relocate. The other thing that is actively being worked on, and I feel certain will be wrapped up in completion this week, is the bird management plan relative to that project. The HRBT expansion project requires preparation of a bird management plan. That plan is going to provide a toolbox of bird management techniques for the contractor to use, give direction on when to use these techniques, and identify those responsible for the various steps in the plan implemented over time, keep records, train personnel, and identify experts to help guide adaptive management as that plan is executed. The bird management plan is a living document. We will have a complete plan this week, but as we learn and as we observe on site and see how the birds are reacting, we'll adjust that plan to learn from that and make it function better. In addition to the bird management plan, VDOT, in consultation with the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, is putting a comprehensive monitoring plan in place to document bird activities, such as different behaviors that are being exhibited, species of birds out there, the bird responses to the contractor's adaptive management strategies as they go forward, along with other observations. VDOT's also putting together a team of world-class experts to further supplement the Commonwealth's expertise that's afforded us through the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. This will ensure we bring the best ideas from Virginia as well as from across the country and perhaps the world to benefit the marine colonial birds as we execute this project. We are absolutely committed to delivering transportation projects with the highest degree of environmental stewardship and making sure that VDOT, alongside our partners, ensure the marine colonial birds are managed with the highest standards in everything that we do. VDOT's also committed to working with our partners at the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries to support the birds population relocation to Fort Wool and new alternative nesting sites both there and on barges. Additionally, VDOT will do everything we can to support the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries identifying and providing a long-term suitable nesting habitat for the marine colonial birds. Currently, VDOT's contracting, procurement, and construction experts are working side by side with their counterparts at the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries to assist in procuring the needed barges for that alternative nesting habitat. I want to personally thank the Deputy Secretary Josh Sachs and the incredible staff at the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. It was really enlightening to me to be out there on the island with them, and they shared so much knowledge with me, and I think really helped me in gaining a much better understanding and making sure that our plans work really well with what they're doing. They've worked incredibly cooperatively through this process to deliver both the largest construction project in the Commonwealth of Virginia, while also ensuring that a Virginia treasure, the colonial birds, are cared for with the highest degree of environmental sensitivity. At this point, I want to turn it over to Deputy Secretary of Natural Resources Josh Sachs, who's going to go into more detail on their efforts to establish the new alternative nesting sites. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary Valentine, members of the CTB, Commissioner Britch. I'm here today to talk to you about the work that the Secretariat of Natural Resources is doing to help protect migratory seabirds, shorebirds on South Wool and related areas, on South Island and related areas. But first, let me make a couple points. The Secretary of Natural Resources covers 5 agencies. You've heard about the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries already today. We also have the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Virginia Marine Resources Commission, the Department of Historic Resources, and the Department of Environmental Quality. And I tell you that today not just because I'm proud of all of our agencies, but because I want you to know that every single one of those agencies is involved in this effort, whether it be permitting or helping facilitate construction or moving equipment. Every one of the agencies in our Secretariat has been brought on board to help with this project. Second, I'd just like to give you a tiny bit of background on birds and what it is that we're dealing with here.
Excuse me.
Did I do something funny?
No.
Oh.
But it's.
I messed up.
Oh.
I think my temperature before I got here.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, you hear a sneeze and it's like, oh my God.
I didn't hear it, but now I'm extra alarmed.
Yeah. Yes.
Thankfully, there's a good radius around this podium.
Yes. We're trying to protect you.
Back to birds. You may or may not know that the South Island, where you will be doing construction for the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, has traditionally been home to thousands of migratory birds every year. And I literally mean thousands. If you go out to that island pre-construction and you'd look around, you cannot take 3 steps without stepping into a huge flock of birds. And these types of birds, when they nest, it's not the type of nest that one might be used to when you were a kid that's made of sticks and twigs and up in a tree. These birds basically nest in a divot in sand. So if you can find a little niche, if you will, these birds will go and they will nest there. And their eggs, are of a light color that could very easily be confused with rocks. I've shown pictures to people and I've said, show me the eggs in this picture, and it's literally like playing Where's Waldo. People cannot do it. Not only do we have this incredible density, but this is a place where these birds that migrate from as far south as South America all the way up to Maine go. And this area is not just a stopover place where they spend the night, but this is an area where they nest and they breed. So survival of this species is incredibly important in this particular part of the world. So with all that said, I'd like to tell you some about the efforts that we are taking to protect these birds as construction begins for the HRBT. And again, let me just be clear, all of our efforts are outside or off of the South Island. Everything that goes on the South Island is the purview of VDOT and its design builders. We are happy to provide guidance, and information, but the purview of everything on South Island is the purview of VDOT. Now, let me tell you what we're doing beyond that. First and foremost, I think it's really important to recognize that the reason we find ourselves in this problem in some cases is that the Trump administration, midway through the permitting of this project, changed how they would handle a federal law called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and how it would impact permitting of this project. That is what it is. We're moving forward, but nonetheless, we need to make sure that in Virginia, things like that don't happen again. And we are unsure if this interpretation the Trump administration used will last permanently. So Governor Northam announced several weeks ago that we, the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries and the Secretary of Natural Resources, would begin a process to create a permitting regime for the incidental take of migratory birds. We continue to work on that, and we hope to put out a discussion draft of that by the end of this month. That will have implications for future construction in the Commonwealth and potentially future construction of VDOT projects. Now moving more specifically to habitat. We're doing two things to ensure short-term habitat for these birds. Two things to make sure that when they come back in just a few weeks, there's somewhere for them to go and nest. The first thing we're doing is there is an island directly adjacent to the South Island. It's technically called Rip Raps Island. Some know it as Fort Wool for the historic fort that was built there. That island, until recently, was being leased. That lease has been severed, and now that island belongs to the Department of Conservation and Recreation. Pardon me, it always has belonged to them, but now they have full control over that island. We intend to take the parade grounds of that island and some parts of the ramparts and turn them into habitat for the birds. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 acres of habitat can be created there. We have already begun work. We have herbicided the island to destroy any vegetation that would distract the birds. We have hired a contracting company that will be starting this week to remove all trees and other obstructions from the island, and then they will come back and put a substrate on the island, about 7 or 8 inches of sand, a thick rocky sand, to create perfect nesting habitat for the birds. Once that's done, we will be implementing a plan to lure or attract the birds from South Island to Rip Raps Island. We will be using 3 speaker systems that make bird calls or bird noises that the birds are used to. We will be placing decoy birds. For those of you who are duck hunters, you may know a decoy is essentially a fake bird that looks just like the real thing. The Audubon Society has donated 20 gold-billed tern decoys. Believe it or not, we were able to find specifically gold-billed tern decoys. They will be deployed. We will be ready in 2 weeks when the birds come back for nesting on Fort Wool. I should also note that I said at the beginning, all of our agencies are involved. That is a fort with historic protections. The Department of Historic Resources will be involved. They have already certified that all of our plans have no adverse impact, and we will be working to ensure that all of the building envelopes are sealed and that bird wires are put on top of structures when needed to keep birds and predator birds off of those. Lastly, we've engaged the USDA Wildlife Services Department to do predator control on the island. Rats, foxes, anything else that might be on that island that could eat eggs is problematic. So we will be engaging in predator control that will start next week to make sure that birds, when they nest, will be safe on the island. In addition to the habitat that we will create on Rip Raps Island, we are going to try something experimental and new, hoping to generate even more habitat. In the area between the 2 islands and the shoreline, we intend to put somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 2 acres of barges for floating temporary habitat. We intend to put those barges for a 5-month period starting in April that would last through the nesting season. We will again put barriers around the barges so birds can't tip over or fall in, so to speak. We will also be putting substrate on those barges to ensure proper nesting habitat for the birds. We have begun the permitting process for those barges already. We are finalizing details on procurement for the barges. They will arrive slightly later than Fort Wool will be ready, but we anticipate having them by middle of April again, when the later species of birds return, in particular the gold-billed tern, which is the most endangered species of them all. That's a later returning species, and we're confident we can have the barges in place when the gold-billed tern returns. With regard to long-term habitat, because it won't be enough to simply protect these birds for a year or 2 years, we're going to have to make sure that when this project is over and in the out years that these birds continue to thrive in this area. So we have several plans. First, what I've just outlined with the barges and Fort Wool or Rip Raps Island will keep these birds in the near vicinity. That's important. So then we can take advantage of that in the future. We have commitments from VDOT and its design builder that when construction ends, 5 years, I think is what we're hoping, fingers crossed.
25.
Yep.
Well, you know, if everything goes.
That's why I said fingers crossed, but then we will reopen as much of the part of South Island that sticks out into the channel to habitat as possible. That'll mean breaking up concrete and relaying substrate down. We are also in early discussions about the potential to either expand part of Fort Wool or the South Island to create more long-term habitat. And finally, DGIF has engaged with the Army Corps of Engineers to begin long-term feasibility studies for the creation of a man-made island somewhere within a 15-kilometer vicinity. Right now, that is in its study phase. We do not know of its feasibility or total cost, but we will continue to pursue that as well. So that combination of actions are all the things that are going on to ensure that the HRBT project can continue with minimal harm to birds and the bird species. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
So no, thank you. And I think as we've been going through this, creating the partnership between VDOT and natural resources, all of those areas, not just in trying to protect the birds, but also financial partnerships, short-term, long-term, helping with procurements, wanting to make sure that we are always working together to get this done. And the fact that while we're doing this in the short time with Habitat, longer term with Habitat, the study that we have with VIMS looking at the impact of transportation on migratory birds and habitats as a part of that.
Yes, thank you, Secretary Valentine. I was remiss in pointing out that VDOT has been a tremendous partner in terms of helping us find the financial resources needed. The things I just described are not cheap, especially when done on very quick timelines. We certainly couldn't be doing that without VDOT and the Secretary of Transportation's help, so thank you for that. And yes, earlier this year, the Secretary of Natural Resources, the Secretary of Transportation, and the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, along with, and I'm going to get this name wrong, the Transportation Research Council, thank you, all came together to sign an MOU that over a period of years will study the impacts transportation projects have on birds like this, and what these birds do to adapt to such changes. And we are hopeful that those studies will give us data and results that we can use in the future as issues like this arise.
And I'll just say before we open it up for questions that the task force, which we set up about 6 months ago, and thankfully Mr. Johnson and Mr. Caswich, you all had co-chaired. There were some who had said to me we weren't sure if that kind of task force in transportation was really a necessary step, and I think we have learned very quickly that it really is a very important step, that we want to be one of those states that really goes beyond what is required. So with that, does anybody have any questions in the room, and then we'll open it up to the phone?
Madam Secretary.
Mr. Yates.
Good morning. First, before I ask my questions, I'd just like to make a point, and that is that we all feel like we know who the expendables are on the CTV now, since we have attendance here.
Yeah, we know who's getting reappointed,
Right.
Mr. Yates. No. I'm kidding.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I've got a multi-questions. Start with the first one. I would assume that the Trump administration regulations made it easier for us to do the project, and we were going down that road first, and now we've gone back to pre-Trump. I would think that's one. Number two, is the barge technology a proven technology? And number three, just could you give us an approximate amount of the cost of what we're taking on? Thank you.
So, to the question about whether or not the change made the project easier or harder, I think that's very much up for debate. It made it easier, I think, to get initial approvals from the Trump administration, but we've seen a lot of consequences since then. Certainly there are state laws that have to be harmonized. There is a lot of public appreciation and interest in the birds, and frankly, having this all things birds be required as part of compliance would perhaps have given greater ability for funding or other things. So I wouldn't say it's made it easier or harder necessarily. It's certainly made it harder for the birds.
But would you mind commenting on the regulations you're trying to develop for Virginia?
Right.
Longer term?
Yes. So in particular, what we're talking about is the Trump administration decided that a longstanding part of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was not going to be enforced anymore. That part was, how do we deal with the incidental take of bird species? Incidental take is take that is not purposeful, but happens in course of doing business or planning something. So if I were going to say build a road, and that meant accidentally destroying habitat, I am no longer required to protect and mitigate and create alternative habitat. As you can see, we're doing that now regardless of the Trump administration's decision. What Virginia is doing is we are putting in place a state level version of that because the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel became the premier example of what can go wrong when the laws change. So that's why we're putting in place a backstop. I think that answers your first question about birds and processes. I know you had a question about cost. Can you remind me of the third one? I'm sorry.
The barge technology.
The barge technology is a fairly novel technology. It has not been used widely, and that's why we are intending to start with a smaller acreage that can be expanded in out years should it work well. We are talking to scientists around the country. Some of the best scientists actually work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are consulting with us regularly. But as I often say to people, no one knows what birds will do. Anyone who tells you they know what birds will do is lying to you. People who have studied the birds for 50 years cannot tell us with any certainty what they will do. That's why we're going to try an array of options, monitor them, and adapt. Finally, with regard to cost, I think that in this first year, all things considered, readying Fort Wool, barges, etc., we're somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 million.
That's cheap. I thought he'd say 10.
Well, we're looking at different things. We're looking at different ways to
those numbers,
support our impact.
That's a lot.
Well, those numbers can increase, and I should also say that what I've talked about right now is for 1 year, we're going to need to mitigate this habitat for the duration of the Hampton Roads project. Some of these costs in the first year will be singular because they're preparatory costs, but things will change, I guarantee it.
And I think, too, we're looking at the cost that if you do look longer term, besides just the short term, longer term, how do you build up the island? How do you expand South Island or build up Fort Wool or look at another island? What does that entail? So we're working through all
Well, the
of
$1 million first year to me was a pleasant thing to hear.
Yeah, I agree.
I was concerned it'd be a lot.
I can make it 5 if you'd
Yeah.
like.
I'm not
glad to
sure
hear
we
it.
should say
It
this
didn't
to
disturb
them.
me, it just surprised me.
So,
I just gave the
Rob, is
commissioner
there
a heart
anything you'd like
attack.
to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say that relative to the question about the changes, I had comments in my presentation specifically about without regard to federal legislation or changes to it or interpretations of it, and Secretary Valentine has made it very clear that without regard to changes like that, we're going to do the right thing and do the things that we know will make a difference. So I guess, the rest of the United States can do what they choose, but in Virginia, we're going to take the high road and do the right thing.
I will just say that it was really important that Fort Wool was made available and how important that was. And it turned out, was it the Department of, do you mind just saying how that happened?
Yes, ma'am.
Because it was just really important to how to put this all together.
Fort Wool, which of course is the island adjacent to South Island, connected by some riprap or a seawall, has for many, many years been rented or leased, to the city of Hampton that would run tours in the summer. I believe the boat is called the Miss Hampton, and they would go out and look at the island. The island has always been owned by the Department of Conservation and Recreation. In recent years, the structures on the island have been in significant decline. We recently sent an engineering team out to do a study and found that the dock, the walkway, the watchtower, and others are not safe for the public any longer. At that point, the city of Hampton chose to end their lease, in which case full control of the island ceded back to the Department of Conservation and Recreation and my secretariat. At that moment, we pounced to use this to become habitat for the birds.
So does anybody on the phone have a question or comment?
Madam Secretary, Scott Kaspowitz with a question.
Okay.
Josh, thanks for a very comprehensive presentation. My question is, how will we monitor the success of our efforts? We're doing some things that haven't been done before. I commend you for the barges in particular, but year over year, understanding what impact we're having on this flock of many thousands of birds would help us understand if the actions we're taking have benefited the birds or if we need to make adjustments. Do we have plans for an active and ongoing monitoring program?
Thank you for the question. Yes, we are working to finalize now, as part of the bird management plan, a series of monitoring actions. There will be bird monitors on the island, I believe 24 hours a day. We will do regular inspections with the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries. We noted earlier the money that had gone to the Transportation Research Council and Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences. All of those entities, as well as the federal government, as they monitor any direct take on the island, will all be watching and monitoring, and we will aggregate that data and learn from it year to year.
So Rob, do you want to tell about, it was part of the bird management plan in the beginning, but we actually, because of how comprehensive we wanted the data collection to be, and with guidance from DGIF as well, we actually pulled it out of the bird management plan and set up a separate, is it MOA, MOU?
Well, what we
With
have
DGIF.
is a separate, basically a separate plan that we're working on with DGIF and VDOT to say exactly what's needed to monitor throughout the process of this project. Looking at, number one, having the experts, the right experts to do that, but then looking at bird behaviors, how they're, are they nesting, how they're being affected by the bird management techniques and so forth, and reporting. This is a very frequent process through every day of the project, where we'll have experts going around the entire South Island, looking at how things are working, looking at how many birds, what types of birds, seeing if there are mating rituals going, all kinds of things. Again, I'm not an ornithologist, just
Because if we learn things, we can do it better.
Right, if we learn, we'll adjust, and that's a big piece of it. And that is outside of the contract per se. That is VDOT and DGIF as two state agencies working specifically to monitor and make sure we're doing everything for the benefit of these birds.
Did you want to say something?
I'd say something. Madam Secretary, Josh and Rob, certainly we have the commitment back with the Department of Game and Inland Fisheries to have the ongoing bird monitoring plan. That certainly will be, as we committed previously, that would be a memorandum of agreement between the two state agencies of the content to be able to make sure that we follow through on that, and it's for the long term during the construction period for the next 5 years. So certainly that's in the works. That's still being reviewed and developed now that we're closer to finishing the bird management plan as it is now.
I would just add, I think, should a bird nest and hatch eggs there, should a brood hatch, should a bird be killed on the island, we'll know that day. This is not going to be the type of thing where we're waiting. We will know that day.
I think we should send Bill Lighty there on a voluntary basis to do this count every day.
Well, it's so interesting, Mr. Williams, that you brought up Mr. Lighty, because I think he's listening.
I hope he is. That's why I mentioned it.
Yeah, so big shout out to Bill Lighty. But I will say that Bill Lighty was one of the first people who mentioned to me the idea of barges. And so I'm hoping, Mr. Lighty, that works. And really, again, just want to thank you for all of your assistance throughout this process.
We'll waive the toll fee for him to go out and do the counts. How about that?
Why don't you say it a little bit louder, because people are complaining they can't hear us. Anyway, we'll share waiving the toll fee for Mr. Lady later.
Madam Secretary?
Mr. Johnson.
Madam Secretary? Yes, good morning. A question, if I may. I recognize there's been a tremendous amount of work put into getting us to the current position that we're in, but I also recognize that permitting is one of the major focuses going forward. So if someone could address, please, what permits people are looking at acquiring that are necessary, and two, through what agencies they're going to be working. And certainly you've got DEQ and BMRC and the Corps of Engineers when you start talking about things either on the water or over the water or in the water. So if somebody could address that, I appreciate it.
Mr. Johnson, for the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project, we still have our permit from the Corps of Engineers in process, and the other permit that we've applied for is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service permit, so that if we were to find a nest or an egg on the island of one of a bird other than the gold-billed tern, we would be working in concert with them and DGIF to appropriately deal with that. So those are the two relative to the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project that are outstanding. I'll let Josh talk to relative to the barges and so forth.
With regard to permitting on Fort Wool, it is not an RPA, so we did not need very much permit at all. We are working with a contractor to get a navigation permit for the barges with the Army Corps. That's a joint permit between the Army Corps and VMRC. Those at present are the only permits we believe we'll need.
Okay.
Thank you.
So with that, gentlemen, I really thank you. We'll look forward to working together. As always, we are somewhat adjacent. Our offices are very close. And Rob, thank you for taking this on as chair of a new subcommittee.
Absolutely. Again, thanks to Josh and Becky and Ruth with DGIF. I mean, just tremendous assets for the state. I just want to say that they've been very, very helpful to us.
Thank you, sir. Jennifer DeBruhl.
I was shocked when he said that.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Got a couple presentations for you today. I'm going to start with a briefing on this summer's WMATA Platform Improvement Program for the Orange Line. Just to give you a little refresher, we were here in March of last year to give you a briefing on the beginning of WMATA's Platform Improvement Project. At that point in time, WMATA has 45 outdoor stations. These are concrete stations that have been exposed to the weather for, in some cases, 35 to 40 years, and they're deteriorating, and they're in need of some significant rehabilitation and reconstruction in order to maintain a state of good repair. The good news is system-wide, 16 stations already have rebuilt platforms. That includes the 6 stations that were rebuilt last summer. 15 have stations that are station platforms that are in good condition, so there are 14 stations left that require attention. WMATA's put a lot of effort into preparing for this. They've looked at a number of different construction approaches, including different ways to do the construction and have maybe less impact on the traveling public. What they looked at was working, in off hours when the passengers weren't, when the system's not open to passengers, a series of weekend shutdowns, and then the complete shutdown and continuous work. Providing that 24/7 complete shutdown access to the system is showing that it would reduce the project duration, it's safer for the individuals that are working, and it does cost less. And we saw this come to pass last summer. So just to give you a little flashback to last summer, WMATA did shut down 6 Metro rail stations south of National Airport on the blue and yellow lines. There was no service between Memorial Day and about a week after Labor Day. Over the summer, WMATA did provide shuttle buses to replace the lost rail service, a bus bridge, and DRPT worked with the local jurisdictions to implement a variety of other mitigation strategies to help offset the traffic impact of that shutdown. DRPT, working with the board, provided $3.6 million in state funding to help the local jurisdictions and the local transit agencies with their mitigation strategies. We had a pretty broad spectrum of strategies last summer, including supplemental local transit service, mobile ticketing, a lot of transportation demand management, marketing, some traffic operational modifications, and also supplemental funding for water taxis in Alexandria. So the outcome of last summer's work, the WMATA shuttles replaced about 60% of the Metro Rail ridership and carried over 2 million passengers during the shutdown period. The state-funded service that Dash provided, and this was just the additional supplemental service that Dash provided, that was extended hours on the King Street trolley and some additional frequencies on some of their routes, provided service for over 29,000 passengers, and over 40,000 trips were provided on the subsidized water taxi service between Alexandria and DC, which came as a little bit of a surprise to us, and a pleasant surprise that so many people took advantage of that water taxi. NVTC did a post-platform reconstruction marketing campaign to get folks back to the Metro Rail system. And after that, after the work was completed and with that promotion, we saw trips on train and bus trips in Northern Virginia go up by more than 1.7 million fourth quarter 2019 compared to the same quarter of 2018. So we were happy to see folks come back to transit. And additionally, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments did analysis of traffic congestion during that time and found that through that slate of mitigation strategies that the traffic bottlenecks stayed within basically the normal expectations for the region during the summer of 2019. So we had a few lumps and bumps in the beginning, but for the most part, traffic congestion stayed about the same as normal, and we were able to accommodate folks through a variety of means to get them to where they needed to go. I think it always helps to see a picture, and it's helpful to see some pictures of before and after to see why this work is so important. These photos are from the King Street station, which is adjacent to our Alexandria office, and a station that I know our office uses quite a bit. The picture in the upper left corner is the before and after. You see not only have the platforms been reconstructed, but there's new lighting, there's new real-time arrival signs. The stations saw a number of customer-facing improvements during last summer's shutdown. Similar set of pictures for the Van Dorn Street station, and so we'll see similar activity this summer on the Orange Line. So looking ahead to this summer, WMATA is going to reconstruct platforms and make other improvements at 4 stations on the Orange Line. Those are East Falls Church, West Falls Church, Dunloring, and Vienna. Once again, it's going to be basically a Memorial Day to Labor Day shutdown period, working within the same confines as we saw last summer. The average AM peak period entries for these 4 stations is over 12,000 trips, so obviously it's going to be important to get those 12,000 folks into another means of transportation when the metro is not available to them. The project, again, the timing is lining up with roadway construction, and so the project is going to occur while the 66 projects are under construction in the same corridor. So for this summer, WMATA has again worked on a mitigation plan. 3 of the 4 stations are going to be full station closures. That's East Falls Church, Dunloring, and Vienna. West Falls Church will remain open, and that will be the origination point of the Orange Line service, but it will operate on a reduced schedule because of single tracking through East Falls Church. WMATA has put together a slate of bus shuttles, similar to last year, to replace the lost rail service. I'll touch on those in more detail in a moment. because those operational details were released by WMATA late last week. They are also removing the parking fees at Dunloring and Vienna as a way to entice folks to take those shuttles to get to where they need to go. But there will be no parking at the East Falls Church station. We did see parking restrictions at all the stations begin this past weekend as the contractor was preparing with mobilization for the work to be done this summer. In terms of mitigation, there are 3 shuttles that are going to operate during all of the operational hours of the Metro Rail system. Those are between Vienna and West Falls Church, Dunloring and West Falls Church, and then East Falls Church and Ballston. During the rush hour, that's going to be supplemented with 2 additional shuttles that are going to provide more express service between Vienna and stations that are open closer into the district at Ballston, Courthouse, and Roslyn, and a shuttle that will basically mirror the Silver Line from Roslyn, Courthouse, and Ballston out to Herndon. Additionally, there are going to be 2 shuttles that are going to operate upon request. Those shuttles will connect Vienna and Dunloring, and then also West Falls Church with East Falls Church as they're needed. Metro announced this shutdown in more detail with the stations being identified back in December. There has been a Northern Virginia stakeholder group that was led by Metro and supported by the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission, a very broad and large group of stakeholders from across the region, across Northern Virginia and across different aspects of transportation, using the same model that we did for 2019. That was in addition to other coordination efforts between the public information officers, the transportation demand management community, and also with VDOT for traffic operations. Similar to last year, DRPT has been working with the local governments, with NVTC, and with VDOT to come up with a plan for some supplemental services to complement the WMATA plan. So WMATA shuttles, as indicated last year, cover about 60% of the service needs in the corridor, but we're working to put together some additional options that basically will help the impacted transit riders and keep them from getting in a single occupant vehicle and causing additional traffic congestion during the shutdown period. We'll also spend a significant amount, as we did last year, educating local communities on the impacts to their travel patterns and their commuting patterns so that they can adapt, and will incentivize the use of transit ride sharing, flexible work schedules, and telework at the same time. So similar to last year, we've been coordinating with local jurisdictions and the transit service providers on some specific strategies. I'll walk you through those strategies in just a minute, but we will be working with them to solicit mid-cycle grant applications. Now that WMATA has released the details of their mitigation plan, we can finalize the details of the supplemental mitigation plan this month. We anticipate being able to award those mid-cycle grants in early April, and again this year we will be using 80% state funding to offset those costs with a 20% local match. Unlike last year, where we had a lot of additional transit service that was provided as part of the mitigation strategy, we're very fortunate that we're in a corridor that, thanks to the I-66 Commuter Choice Program, we have a lot of additional corridor-wide transit service. So we're seeing more of a focus on transportation demand management in this year's strategies. Things like the mobile commuter store deployment with Arlington County. We're seeing some transportation operational improvements and mitigation strategies where we're working with Arlington on some congestion and curb management so that we can keep those transit buses moving through the traffic and the congestion near those transit stations. We do have some supplemental transit service with the Fairfax Connector, and also some supplemental trips with OmniRide, PRTC, as overcrowding may exist on their I-66 commuter buses. City of Fairfax is going to operate a free shuttle service to the Burke VRE station. Our I-66 Transit and TDM study last year showed that VRE is a great reliever for 66 traffic, and also running parallel to the Orange Line is a great alternative for the individuals in that area. City of Falls Church is kind of at ground zero of this year's shutdown. There are some transit opportunities there, but is a lot of discussion we're having with City of Falls Church on transportation demand management and congestion management that'll be part of their mitigation strategies. NVTC is going to do their post-shutdown transit marketing campaign again this year. DRPT, we're going to be working on expanded promotion of telework through our Telework Virginia program. And with all of the local jurisdictions and the transit agencies, there's a significant amount of outreach, marketing, to make sure that everybody's aware of the transportation alternatives that are available for them. So in terms of next steps, no CTB action is required to support this supplemental mitigation this year. We did, in preparation for this summer's shutdown occurring in fiscal year 20, we did include funding in our 6-year program in anticipation of this work, so we're ready to go. We don't need to bring you an action item today to do that. We're already working with the localities to deploy strategies in advance of the work beginning in May. As I indicated, some of the parking changes have already occurred, and the localities are already working to mitigate. We will continue to monitor the strategies continually to allow for real-time adjustments if some of the services are utilized more than others. And once we finish this summer's platform improvement program work, there are still 2 Virginia stations that will require platform reconstruction. That's Arlington National Cemetery and Reagan National Airport, and we do not yet have a schedule from WMATA for those 2 stations. And with that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Madam Secretary.
Mr. Yates.
I have a question for you. Based on the current economic and health situation, is there any possibility, has any thought been given to moving up the construction schedule to take advantage of the low ridership now? And I know you might say it's
I was thinking the
possible.
same thing.
But you know, the fact that it's a proactive thing, is it possible to start April 15th instead of Memorial Weekend?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I don't think this mic is working well for some reason. I've only got one. Repeat the question.
Okay, I can.
Try one more time.
Is there any chance to move the construction schedule up sooner to take advantage of the low ridership right now?
It seems like it would be a great idea, but I think there's a significant amount of mobilization associated with getting the construction crews in place and getting things ready. Their mobilization period was already over 60 days just to get things started for the contractor.
I think it's worth checking though.
We can follow up.
On this island as fast as we did. I mean, you know, things are down right now. It'd be worth a shot, I think, to check at least.
We can certainly follow up with WMATA and see if that's possible.
I think that is just a great idea. So anyway, yes.
Madam Secretary, it's Mary Hines.
Oh, hey, Miss Hines.
How are you?
I am fine.
So this year, I do have a question for John. So this will be the second year. First of all, great applause to DRPT and all the regional agencies that are working on this. I'm curious what lessons were learned about commuter preferences last year, and whether any of the mitigation strategies have persisted since we went back to full service.
So lessons learned from
Lessons learned.
So it was a little bit hard to hear you, but I think you were looking for some of what we've learned. And we did work with the local governments and the transit agencies to go back and assess the strategies and how they worked last year. And certainly we've used that in working with, in some cases, a different slate of jurisdictions this year to prepare mitigation strategies. I think we were pleasantly surprised by the success of the water taxi. And some of the shorter term shuttles were not as popular last year, and so we only have one of those in the slate of recommendations for this year, where I think we had 3 or 4 last year. So we did make some adjustments based on last year's experience.
Anybody else?
Madam Secretary.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
Sorry. The question I had that perhaps you didn't hear was, did any of the changes that you made last year persist into general practice?
So one really good example of that was the mobile ticketing pilot that we did with the city of Alexandria. It was a short-term, it was initially envisioned as a short-term pilot to help when people didn't have access to the metro stations to buy smart trip cards. It turned out to be quite popular and is now being expanded within the Dash system. And in fact, they've applied for funding this year to do some pretty innovative work with real-time arrival information through that mobile application. So I think that's probably the best example that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, there was somebody else who wanted to ask a question.
Madam Secretary.
Hello, Mr. Whitworth.
Hello to you. Jennifer, the Van Doren and the Vienna terminals, when were they constructed?
Vienna was constructed, I was living in Fairfax County at the time, and I think it was I would say the early to mid 1980s.
Okay, my question had to do with the 35 to 40 year deterioration, and do we now have a schedule for all platforms that we know when we need to replace them?
Yes, so this was, if you'll recall, the work that was done by Secretary Ray LaHood and the study that happened a few years ago. One of the items was developing a more specific long-term maintenance and state of good repair plan, and ensuring that the core capacity of the system is maintained so that these assets are taken care of. This is a big piece of that. And so taking care of these 45 outdoor platforms and outdoor stations, and then keeping them in a state of good repair going forward is certainly significant for WMATA and an improvement that we've seen since dedicated funding became available.
And Mr. Whitworth,
Thank you.
I just looked up the age of the stations, and both of them were opened in 1986.
Good job, Jennifer.
Thank you.
I was an early rider of the Orange Line when I was in.
Anything else from
Cool.
somebody on the phone?
Madam Secretary Miller.
Hey, Mr. Miller.
Good morning. Jennifer, I think I heard you say that the WMATA mitigation would take care of about 50% of the issue. If that's correct, I think I heard you say that. And that we have some state and local mitigation efforts. What's the combined percent of demand that you feel can be mitigated by all the procedures?
So when we looked back at last year, WMATA's shuttles that they operated carried about 60% of the average daily ridership for those stations, and then we had the supplemental mitigation measures. While it's hard to come up with a specific number, we did not see large-scale traffic congestion impacts last summer, which would say that people either didn't travel or they took one of the other modes of transit that was available to them.
So is it safe to say you think the gap is not going to be a big problem, if you will?
I would say that
The gap between 100% demand and whatever we're mitigating.
yeah, I think having a good transportation demand management strategy is important, and that public education of the other options that are available to individuals enables them to either take a different mode or to potentially telework or avoid taking a trip that would add additional congestion to I-66. So I think we're pretty close to closing that gap with the strategies. I think we showed that last summer, and we're taking the same approach for the 2020 shutdown campaign.
Fine, thank you. Great work.
Okay. Well, thank you. I am going to switch the program. Oh, do you have something else?
No.
Okay, but we can come back on this subject. We wanted to give those here on the CTB and those of you on the phone an update on where we are with COVID-19. And so, yes, so Cathy, do you want to make the introduction?
Absolutely.
Yes. So we have been working on the coronavirus really since mid to late January, when this very first came to be an issue. There's been a tremendous amount of work that's been done. I have asked Cathy McGhee, Director of Research and Innovation, to be the point person in transportation across all modes on this particular issue. But I also wanted you to hear from our Department of Health on what we're doing here in Virginia to give you all the most recent updates. And so with that,
thank you. So I'm going to give you an update on what our agencies are doing to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. But first, I'm going to introduce Dr. Laurie Forlano, the Deputy Commissioner for Population Health at the Virginia Department of Health, to give us that more general overview.
so Dr. Forlano, thank you so much for coming. And Dr. Forlano actually changed her schedule so that you could be here to speak to us.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Can you all hear Dr. Forlano?
I'll try to speak up as best I can. Thanks for the opportunity today. My name is Dr. Laurie Forlano. I serve as a Deputy Commissioner at the Health Department, and I previously served as the State Epidemiologist for many years. So I've worked in disease control and epidemiology my entire career in public health.
I'm going to interrupt for 1 second. For those of you on the phone, would you mind muting your line? Thank you.
Great, super, thank you. Currently the Commonwealth has set up a unified command. So currently I'm serving as the operations director for the statewide COVID-19 response, which includes a lot of work and a lot of groups working really hard. I think what's most relevant to this group today is our community mitigation team. So we're doing our best to keep apprised of the situation and provide guidance to partners in transportation, childcare, businesses, universities, schools, etc. So we are really grateful for the opportunity today. And I will say I'm very grateful to the efforts you're taking to maintain continuity of government, but socially distanced. For those on the phone, it's quite the sight. Everybody is adhering to social distancing, so thank you for doing that. So the first thing I'll say today in my remarks is that I'm sure you can appreciate that this is rapidly evolving. So what I say today could change as soon as an hour from now or tomorrow. So just keep that in mind. And the best thing to do is keep regular visits to our website, which we update multiple times a day. I know everyone has probably been inundated by the media, appropriately so, with COVID-19, but I do want to make sure you have the right background in science. This began as a cluster of pneumonia cases in Wuhan City, China, in a province called the Hubei province in late December. And those cases initially tested negative for things like flu, SARS, MERS, bird flu, etc. And by early January, the World Health Organization had identified the virus as a novel organism, and it identified it as a coronavirus. So over the following weeks, obviously, initial cases started to surge in China. In late January, on the 23rd, they were placed on lockdown in that city. They restricted all land and air travel out of that area, and to date, no other area had seen that kind of attack rate that had been observed in China. There's a really significant shift in the trend we've seen over the last, I'd say, week to 10 days. In the beginning of this, so in late December, early January, all of the cases were in China, and their curve was going steeply upward. Now, most of the cases that are being counted on a daily basis are outside of China. So that's a really significant epidemiologic shift that we're observing. In early February, the United States placed travel restrictions on people entering the United States who had been in China within the past 14 days of their arrival to the United States. So when we get data from the Centers for Disease Control, this is actually a pretty routine operation for us. For example, if someone is found to have tuberculosis and has been on an airplane, we get notified through the Division of Global Migration and Quarantine, the federal level. We're provided contact information. We contact that individual. We work with the airlines to determine who's sitting around them or close to them and give appropriate advice. So that same system is being used here for the travelers that are arriving from China. I will say that traveler data and monitoring system is still unique to travelers from China, and it's been slightly expanded to travelers from Iran, but not completely. There are expanding travel advisories that have happened over the last coming days, frankly, and weeks. Most of Europe is considered a level 3 area in the world, which means avoid non-essential travel. And if you are an American that's coming home from one of those areas, you are instructed to self-quarantine for 14 days. All foreign nationals that have had any history of travel to any level 2 or 3 travel designated area in the world are not allowed to enter the United States at this time. But we do support, obviously, the return of Americans. Some terms that I'll just go over very quickly because they're easily confused. Isolation separates sick people from well people. Quarantine separates people who are not sick. So a tip is if you are ill, you are isolated. If you are healthy, you are quarantined. As of last night, Virginia had identified 51 cases of COVID-19 in residents, so we very much expect this number to increase in the coming weeks and months, and we are preparing and frankly just in response mode now. It's been declared a pandemic. The disease itself has pretty unspecific symptoms: fever, lower respiratory cough. It can look like flu this time of year or any other of the number of respiratory viruses that circulate this time of year. So it is, in the beginning, a little bit difficult to distinguish. There's widespread COVID-19 transmission in China, South Korea, Iran, and Italy. Sustained community transmission has been identified in Japan, and all of those travel advisories can be found on the CDC's website or the World Health Organization. There's a slight distinction if you're a traveler that comes from a level 3 country versus a level 2 country. If you're arriving from a level 3 country, China, Iran, Italy, you are instructed to self-quarantine and stay home. You're essentially told, stay home. If you are arriving from a level 2 country, there's a subtlety to the language. You're recommended to socially distance and to the extent possible, stay home. But again, I pretty much anticipate that subtlety will probably change in time, and we are really considering most travelers, regardless of 2 or 3, we're advising them to stay home and socially distance. To prepare, which I'm certain many of the partners that you work with have already done, make sure they have emergency operations plans in place. Continuity of operations is essential, not only for just your regular business and transportation, but for us as part of the response. We need to make sure that essential workers are able to get to work. Healthcare, critical infrastructure, childcare, public health. We need to ensure that people have a way to get to work, but ensuring their safety and the safety of the staff that man those transportation systems. Please, we encourage transportation and all other partners to ensure their policies are up to date regarding cleaning frequency, have plans in place for absenteeism. We support and encourage liberal absence and sick leave policies for staff that are staying home when sick, so they indeed stay home when they're sick. We encourage the creation of information sharing pathways. All local transportation or other partners should have really a direct line to their local health department so they understand what recommendations are in place, but also what to do if someone becomes ill during travel or if a staff person becomes ill. I will say there are no specific guidelines or doing a contact investigation on mass transit, like a metro or something like that, because those types of transportation aren't seated. So it's difficult for us to determine what level of contact a person had with someone who was on a metro or a bus, because it's a little bit hard to determine their level of risk. So we just encourage messaging, education. And there are some instances with some diseases, like measles is a good example, where we would make an announcement if someone had been in an airport or on a bus or in a transit center because of the nature of that disease. That's not the case yet for COVID-19, but we might evolve to that in the future. We welcome your partnership, and I really would welcome your input and feedback about what you need from the health department, how we can partner together, how you can help us get messages out, and how we can help to assure the continuity of the services that are so important. The main messages for stakeholders right now are make sure staff are aware of what this is and how they can protect themselves. Encouraging sick employees to stay home. If they become sick when they're at work, to separate them as much as possible until they can get home. Hand washing, respiratory etiquette. They should report, employees should feel safe reporting other needs they have if their children are now at home, if they have school-age children. And so we need to create safe work cultures where people can say, my kids are at home, or I have been sick, so we can control the spread as much as possible. There are EPA recommended cleaning products and cleaning frequencies and schedules that are available on our website, and I'm happy to provide those links afterwards. That's really kind of the nuts and bolts of the update, but I welcome any conversation if we have time today.
So if you could stay for about
Sure,
5
absolutely.
minutes or so, I thought Cathy could give the update from transportation because you may get questions that we'll go ahead and answer.
Yeah.
And then John Scrivani's here, who is leading the effort here at VDOT as well. So if you wouldn't mind, and then people can ask questions, you know.
All
Hello,
right.
Ms. McGhee.
Hello. Thank you. So I want to go through what we've been doing across the Secretariat in response to COVID-19. When I first started requesting information from all of the agencies, I asked for it in 3 buckets. I always like to talk to you guys about my buckets. Workforce, customers, and supplies. So what are you doing to make sure your workforce is safe? What are you doing to make sure your customers are safe and served? And then what issues are you having or do you anticipate having with supplies? And so just in general, I would say that the responses to the first and the last are fairly similar across the board. With respect to workforce, those messages about personal hygiene are going out, the stay home if you're sick, cover your cough, wash your hands, telework if you're able. I will say that has been increasing in the last day. And so we're seeing much, much more of our workforce teleworking, and I think that's a great thing in terms of increasing that social distance. This building is very, well, not this one. The building next door is very quiet. The Patrick Henry building is very quiet, and I think those are very good things as we go forward. On the supply front, everyone is watching their supply chains in terms of what they need to do their job. The port is watching that very carefully, looking for additional suppliers. VDOT is considering that across the range of activities that the agency undertakes every day. There are no issues to date. That obviously may change the longer this goes on. The biggest supply issue is in PPE and hand sanitizer. We're having quite the challenge finding hand sanitizer, and so if we had a request, it would be help in finding hand sanitizer, particularly for our rural transit agencies and others who are going through that quite quickly as this goes on. And now I'll just speak to each agency individually. I'll start with DRPT. Andrew Ennis has been amazing in keeping me updated on what's going on across the Commonwealth. I'll start with the big providers. Amtrak is reducing service on its Virginia-sponsored routes. Really, the only route that has changed in terms of its number of trips is Route 50, which is Norfolk to Washington. They've gone from 2 trains a day to 1 train a day. Some of those trains, even across the other routes, are being shortened to match demand, but the service is still being provided. So I think that's important to note. Metro is seeing some pretty significant changes in their service. They've gone to 12-minute headways on trains throughout the day. So that is a longer headway than normal. And Metro Bus is operating on a Saturday schedule. So the weekend buses remain unchanged, but the weekday buses are operating on a Saturday schedule. This again is in response to a great degree to changes in demand. For example, on the 11th, last Wednesday, ridership was down 100,000 riders from the Wednesday prior. And we'll, I'm sure, continue to see that increase, those decreases increase, if that makes sense, as more and more people telework and seek options for social distancing. As we look across the Commonwealth at other transit agencies, VRE is operating on their S schedule. So if you look at online at the VRE schedule, only routes that have an S are currently operating. Virginia Breeze, which serves Blacksburg to DC, has temporarily eliminated their Friday afternoon northbound, Sunday afternoon southbound route. Virginia Tech has gone to online courses, so there aren't as many people making that trip on any given weekend. Harrisonburg, Arlington County, Alexandria, Petersburg, Blacksburg, Williamsburg, they've all reduced their service in one way or another, again, in response to reductions in demand. VDOT, obviously, working very closely with its partners, on Friday evening did issue a waiver for commercial vehicles for both hours of service and weight limits, so long as those vehicles are operating in support of emergency supplies and services. So that's just to make sure that supplies are able to get where they need to be. FMCSA issued a similar hours of service relief waiver over the weekend, so we're just sort of supplementing that here in Virginia. There are ongoing efforts to identify essential tasks that the agency undertakes. John Scrivani is leading an effort across the agency. He's developed a great online tool for people to go in and enter those essential tasks, whether or not they can be handled remotely, what resources would be required for them to be handled remotely, and where we need to be really careful about special licenses or certifications. You can think about our ferry boat operators. Obviously, they are specially licensed. If they were to get ill, we need to make sure we have a plan. VDOT is also communicating with contractors and consultants to make sure that projects keep moving to the degree possible. I don't know, Commissioner, if you wanted to comment on that. I know you had some communication with VTCA yesterday.
I'll wait till the end.
We'll wait to the end. All right. We'll keep moving then. Oh, the ferries are operating on a slightly reduced schedule to make sure, again, we keep those ferry operators available should someone fall ill. DMV, probably the one agency in the Secretariat that sees more Virginians on a daily basis. Definitely the one agency that sees more customers on a daily basis.
In fact, they see more than any agency. I thought they were the most, but it turns out that the most is ABC stores.
But there are more ABC stores than there are customers.
Commissioner Holcomb always points out they're probably happier at ABC as well. But still, they are really ambassadors on the ground. So
approximately 25,000 customers per day at the customer service centers across the Commonwealth. If you've been to a DMV recently, you know it's really hard to practice social distancing in one of their lobbies because of the number of people. So we're looking at ways to help them with that issue. Obviously, the big one is encouraging online transactions. They estimate about 75% of the transactions they see on a daily basis could be handled online if people chose to do so. So we're really going to do some outreach to help people understand what they can and can't do online. Obviously, Real ID, which everyone's heard so much about, cannot be done online right now, and we are still at this stage facing that October deadline that the federal government has put in place for Real ID. Hopefully we'll get some relief there, but as of today, that has not happened.
But we are working on it.
We are working on it. Department of Aviation, I'll hit on briefly. For our own internal flight services, they are again isolating wouldn't be the right word here, segregating crews and aircraft, so they reduce the chance of cross-contamination, so the same crew works together all the time in the same aircraft. Those are for flights that internal folks are taking with state planes. As we look out across the airports in the Commonwealth, Dulles Airport is one of the 13 that does receive passengers who have been in one of those restricted countries in the prior 14 days. So CDC is there conducting screenings.
Screenings,
yeah. Very careful about my words there. to determine which passengers might need follow-up. Airlines at both Dulles and Reagan National, as well as our air carrier airports across the Commonwealth, are seeing reductions in demand, and airlines are reducing flight schedules as a result of that. I think it's probably safe to say that that also will continue. There are many places, even in this country now, that you cannot travel, or it is strongly advised against traveling to and from. So I think we will continue to see reductions in flight schedules as this goes on. No one arriving at Dulles, has tested positive to our knowledge, but again, we might not necessarily know.
Well, and really, the CDC is screening.
Yes, CDC
So
is
that's
screening,
what-
and then that's
It was
all
really
on
just
them.
for those arriving from China and Iran.
Yes.
So it's a very limited.
And now it's been expanded. As of Friday, the travel ban was expanded, and so their screenings have also expanded, and so that has happened. I mentioned the Port of Virginia earlier. Obviously, they're monitoring the situation, updating their forecast for volume and the corresponding economic impacts that might bring. They are identifying critical parts to make sure their operation is continued without interruption. There are perhaps some challenges in lead time that they are making sure they have secondary suppliers for all of those parts. They are tracking all the costs that they're incurring as a result of COVID-19, which also DRPT has asked our transit agencies to do, so that we can make sure we have an accounting when we do reach the end of this situation. That is all I have to share with you. I'm happy to answer any questions about what our agencies are doing, or any questions. We'll ask Dr. Forlano to come back.
I just want to add really quickly that, at Dulles, it's CDC and U.S.
Yes.
Customs managing this process, so the experts are taking care of that. There has been a COVID-19 task force set up at the state level, so that we're all coordinating. Obviously, at the secretary level, we're all coordinating. There's a call every day at 8:30, among others, but Cathy and/or I are joining that as well. But we're working very hard to try to deliver the services, government services, as we protect customers and employees. So, did you want to say something before we bring Dr. Forlano back, or John Scrivani?
No, I did. I want to follow up with a couple items that Cathy had touched on and expand on. First and foremost, our rest areas certainly remain open to the public. We have increased our surface cleaning of hard surfaces, vending machines, and bathrooms. Certainly for the protection, we'll need to reevaluate as this spreads as to whether or not we're going to continue to increase those cleaning services or look to shut down the facilities. But at least at this standpoint, the rest areas remain open. I will say that those rest areas that have welcome centers, the welcome centers have closed, but we continue to maintain the safety rest areas. Cathy did touch on the ferry boat operations, and certainly we have reduced the ferry boat operations in an effort to be able to maintain service provisions between Williamsburg, James City County, and Surrey County. And we're continuing to maintain and watch the demand that is between there. Do we need to go back to full capacity? We'll reevaluate it, but the main part is making sure that we continue to have services, the critical linkage in that service chain, remain in place while the virus is there. One of the measures that we're also taking is requesting the patrons that are using the ferry operation is to remain in their vehicles so that it does not have additional spread to our staff and our deckhands. Tunnels, our movable bridges, and our safety service patrols, we're going to continue to maintain operations as they are right now. However, we're asking for reduced staffing plans. What is the bare minimum that we can get by with? But for right now, there is no reduction in service. Public hearings, I want to point out, have been postponed for at least the next 30 days. We will not be issuing any notices for intent to hold a public hearing. During the same time period, we will reevaluate within the next 2 weeks. Everyone's talking about flattening the curve. I'm afraid that it's going to be beyond the 30-day window that we're looking at right now, but we need to recognize that our public hearings are given notices 30 days in advance, so as we start coming out of this, we want to be well prepared for picking up business as usual. But for all intents and purposes, right now, our public hearing process is closed. The two other points that I will have is our construction program and our maintenance program. We are continuing to staff at the levels that are required and sufficient. I'm going to say we are business as usual when it comes to this. We have had conversations with our private sector partners, the contracting industry. They are eager to get outside. They are eager to continue to do their work. This is a part of the economy that we can continue to have. We will be issuing guidance to our construction and maintenance staff about making sure that they have proper hygiene, the proper PPE out in the field. Fresh air and UV light, I think, is the best thing for people at this point, as long as we have some distance and separation for them. But by and large, the comment that was made yesterday during our conference call was that they are full steam ahead, and we will provide the individuals, our inspectors and our construction engineers in the field to be able to maintain schedule, at least at this point. We are also, to Cathy's point about the supply chain, we're seeing no breaks in the supply chain. Our supplies are adequate for right now. It's something that we're going to continue to watch. Our construction and maintenance partners have indicated as well that the aggregate producers all see that there's an abundance of supply that's readily available to continue to maintain schedule without a break at this point in time. The footnote is that's all subject to change. We'll continue to monitor it. And finally, within the department, we continue to have leadership calls. We had one this morning at 8:30, but we're going to continue to have them at least once every two days. But as the climate changes or this changes very rapidly, we may reevaluate and have that on a daily basis. But by and large, we're giving guidance out on teleworking and encouraging our employees to telework as much as possible, but also recognize that we do have a number, almost 3,000 to 4,000 staff people that are going to be out in the field doing the work of maintaining our highway facilities, emergency repairs, and so on and so forth. So at least for right now, I want to say business as usual, with the exception of social on construction and maintenance.
So, because I don't want to hold up Dr. Forlano, I'm going to ask Jennifer to give a quick update, from your end on COVID-19, and then I'll just bring Dr. Forlano up for anybody who has questions for the doctor, and then we can ask John Scrivani if there was anything we wanted to add.
Yeah, and I think Cathy gave a pretty good update of where most of the transit systems are. We are hearing, and we're in almost daily contact with the majority of our 41 transit systems, along with Amtrak and the railroads. And I do also want to recognize Andrew Ennis in the back of the room, who oversees our security and emergency preparedness programs. But a lot of the transit systems are reporting very decreased ridership, and also some difficulties with supply chain issues as well, but they are all employing very extensive cleaning programs and with daily cleanings, much far beyond what they normally would do. This is a very difficult balance because while I think everybody, another issue I would say that they're balancing as well is absenteeism, and they're very concerned about the exposure of their workforce as well. It's very important that we keep some of these transit systems running, especially agencies like WMATA, where having transit available is so important for the healthcare workforce and for other essential personnel. And so those needs are being balanced with risks of exposure. But that's all of the transit systems are monitoring this and reporting back to us on a daily basis. Amtrak is seeing some significant decreases in ridership as well, about 50 to 60% compared to a couple weeks ago. So they also are monitoring things on a daily basis and making decisions as they go along. They have requested supplemental emergency funding from Congress in any sort of emergency appropriations bill as well. So we'll see where that goes. One of the items that you'll have on the action meeting agenda is that we are going to request your approval of some emergency operating assistance. So hopefully you'll saw the resolution for that as well.
So we'll have that press release going out, and as of 11:59 tonight, we are closing our DMVs. So that announcement will be going out as well. Online transactions will be available to everyone, and we'll be making very clear, what transactions can actually take place. There will also be a 60-day grace period for people to get those transactions done. And so, Dr. Forlano, would you mind just coming back in case anybody here has questions or anybody on the phone? Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation today, and appreciate all the work you're doing to keep us all safe. Can you just give us your perspective on progress with the vaccination?
Yeah, obviously a lot underway with that. My understanding is that they started work on that as soon as...
I'm going to ask you this.
Sure.
Will you speak up?
Sure, no problem. Sorry about that. The question was about vaccine production and efforts there. My understanding that it will take, best case scenario, up to 12 months for that to be produced, safety tested, etc., and then made available to the public.
There was a news program last night of the first person to get the vaccine.
In trials. Yeah, so they're definitely expediting it in obviously a safe manner, but they're streamlining the process.
And what about the testing kits and the protocol for testing?
It's one of the most frequent questions we get. So there are two kind of lines of testing. The first line is the public health testing line. So individuals that meet certain criteria can be tested through our state public health laboratory, but they have to meet those criteria. It's reserved for people who are contacts to confirm cases of COVID-19, those who are seriously ill and hospitalized, and then there's a criteria around those living in nursing homes or those kinds of settings, have tested negative for flu and other viruses, etc. For other individuals that do not meet those criteria, they can seek testing through their healthcare providers and private laboratories, for example, LabCorp, Quest. Further, there are some academic centers that are working hard to develop their own assays, which is typical in a response like this. But there are some challenges, speaking of supply chain, that I heard some folks talking about in your field. Some of the issues that happen here is that they need certain kinds of reagents to test and validate the lab assays. And now there's reagents, they're trying to work together. We've seen really wonderful partnership with smaller research labs offering up those kinds of supplies and materials so the academic labs can build it. So right now, the State Public Health Lab has the capacity to test, I think, probably a few hundred people right now. They've already placed orders to the Centers for Disease Control for more kits. When those will arrive is not clear.
Can I follow up on the question?
Mr. Brown.
So, in following up on that, I know that there are different states are managing it differently. Mm-hmm. I know that Massachusetts and California, they've contracted with their academic hospital systems to develop their own tests that are more rapid response, similar to the flu test, that allow for a presumed determination, of course, subject later to further validation. And what I understand is that Virginia is exploring that same thing with maybe the University of Virginia developing that. Can you expand upon what's happening there?
I think you just described it really well, actually. So yes, I believe University of Virginia, and I don't want to misspeak, but perhaps Virginia Commonwealth University, or large academic medical centers, are definitely beginning those efforts to develop their own assays, but they do need to be, they work out validation protocols with our state public health lab, but they are eager to get those up and running. It helps with testing capacity, for sure.
So do we know what the timing on that is?
I don't really have the answer to that right now.
Anybody on the phone have a question for Dr. Forlano, sorry.
Yeah, you got it.
Dr. Furlow is on my brain.
Well.
Forlano.
There's no furlough.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, I know one of the questions that came up. You know, we've been approached about so many different organizations who want to be deemed essential services. And so how is that criteria set? Or how is that determined?
Well, I think I can, obviously within your own agency, the Department of Transportation, Department of Health, we're determining those services ourselves within our own state agencies. Response-wide, I think we're working that out, if I'm speaking frankly. That healthcare providers, obviously, critical infrastructure, transportation, trash collection, maintenance of roads, first responders, childcare, obviously, is a hot topic right now. And so we are working with our partners in social services and education to build plans to assure sufficient childcare for essential providers as well.
So, Ms. DeTonka, is there anything that you'd want to add to that list?
Yes,
Please do.
financial services.
Absolutely.
I think are critical to keep everybody being able to provide the needs.
We do have, I'm glad you brought that up, we do have an economic stability work group as part of the response because we fully understand the economic impact this is having right now.
If we're looking at what's happening in Europe and extrapolate that here, this is one of those questions that you don't have an answer to, I'm sure, but I don't know if we're looking at a complete quarantine area, would it be a phased-in approach or?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general principle of disease control in something like this is to try to use local epidemiology and data as much as possible, but that is always combined with judgment and community considerations and other unique factors. I think I fully expect cases to go up. I fully expect different areas of the Commonwealth to experience this at different times. And I also expect that we will eventually get to a place where we will have to take some, Commonwealth-wide measures, as have already been announced by the governor.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, I was going to ask a question. Essential services, who determines that? The Department?
I think that would not the Department of Health, no, in partnership with what we call Unified Command, so the Health Department, Virginia Department of Emergency Management, in partnership with the Cabinet and other leadership.
So, and I want to make sure, the Cathy McGhee, that we make sure to refine that list.
Yeah.
So,
really appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you so much for
something
being
like this.
here.
It's definitely a team approach. So thanks, and wash your hands.
Yeah, wash your hands, sanitizer in the back of the room, and cleaning has been a huge part of our lives, I will just say. I am going to step away for just a minute. I'm going to turn this over to Allison.
Madam Secretary, I got a question for Cathy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's like, with all the telecommunications, obviously people staying home, is there any issues in relation to networks? I've heard networks have been overrun in some parts of the country already. I think maybe the first thing we warned last thing.
So I will tell you, we have in the Commonwealth a virtual private network that we can use. I can use when I'm teleworking to get into the VDOT network. I was unable to get into it this morning. I think I also have a college student that's now working from home. I'm glad to have him there, but he's not very happy to be there. And I think as we see more and more of that, as these college students begin streaming online classes, it's going to strain our infrastructure. I don't have any data for you other than I was unable to get into the VPN, but I think that's a real concern.
Mr. Yates?
Yes, I have a question, a comment for the commissioner. A couple things. I would hope that we do everything we can to keep the rest areas open, because I think some of the private places will be closing, and I think our local facilities are much cleaner, so I really hope that's something you can push. The second thing is, as far as the 30-day public hearings, I hate to see that slow down construction and work. Is there anything that we can do to get around the 30-day public hearings telephonically, by law? I mean, if this extends 90 more days and we delay construction because of no public hearings, what about that?
Mr. Yates, what I'm going to say, let me first address the rest areas. Certainly, we share the same sentiments, is that we want to keep those facilities open as long as possible. If we need to continue to increase the amount of cleaning, we'll certainly do so. We think that's a vital part of providing safety rest areas for the traveling public. With regard to the 30-day moratorium on public hearings, we are investigating virtual public hearings, whether or not that will meet the Code of Federal Regulations and meet those intent. We share the same exact sentiments that we do not want to slow down our program whatsoever, whether it's in the preliminary engineering side of the house or the construction side at this point in time, but we'll need to continue to investigate the opportunities for using virtual public hearings, recognizing that we're in extraordinary times at this point. Those conversations have already started being had. I would envision that we're going to continue to have those until we can come to some resolution on whether or not we can use virtual hearings.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? All right, Jennifer? Thank you.
So next, wait for it to come up on the screen. Other presentation I have for you today is an update on our transit application process. We're in the middle of that process and preparing to bring you recommendations at your May meeting, but felt like it was timely to give you an idea of where we are in light of the legislative session that's wrapped up and where we will be going with the transit program. So you have it on your screens. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, even though it's not up on the big screen. You may recall that last year we had some significant changes to the Transit Capital Program and how we go through and prioritize our applications for funding for state of good repair, for minor enhancement, for major expansion projects. As a refresher, for our state of good repair projects, those projects are scored on a 100-point scale, with 60 points being related to the asset condition, its age, its mileage, and then 40 points based on the impact that that asset has on the transit operations. For this particular grant cycle, we received requests for 319 items, or 319 applications. We've scored them. Our scores range from a high of 97 to a low of 9 on that scale of 1 to 100. Much like last year, the items that scored well were our vehicles, whether they are revenue vehicles like our transit buses and vans, and support vehicles that help the transit agencies deliver their service, operating and administrative hardware that is beyond its useful life, and the replacement of customer-facing facilities and infrastructure. Once again this year, items that didn't score well are items that aren't yet at their useful age and mileage, and items that are administrative in nature. And the total state assistance that was requested was $52.8 million. For minor enhancements, and these are projects or items that have a small incremental increase in service that's provided, they cost less than $2 million and are a small number of expansion vehicles. These items, because we're not replacing something that already exists, they're scored based just on that service impact score, and they can receive up to 40 points. For minor enhancements, we received applications for 158 individual line items. Scores for those items range from a high of 37 to a low of 8 on that scale of 1 to 40. The items that scored well are similar to the state of good repair. It's expansion vehicles, maintenance equipment and parts, small minor system infrastructure and facility upgrades, and then equipment and technology that support transit operations. And the items that don't score well are those that are administrative in nature, primarily administrative computers, hardware, and then software licenses. The total state assistance that was requested was $71 million. A big chunk of this is funding that we have historically provided to VRE for their track lease payments. Those track lease payments will move out of the transit program this year and over to the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority with the passage of the Transportation Omnibus Bill. For major expansion, these are larger projects typically. They're over $2 million, can be much larger than that are adding significant capacity to our transit systems, and they're scored on a set of factors, same factor areas as smart scale, but with measures that are scaled and appropriate specific to transit projects. We received 3 major expansion projects this year for scoring. The Ballston Metro Station East entrance, that's a second entrance to that metro station. Hampton Roads Transit submitted an application for a very significant system-wide mobile ticketing project. And in Blacksburg, they've seen great growth in their ridership and their level of service. And they have submitted an application for an expansion of their administration and operational facility. We're still working to complete the benefit scores for those projects and to finalize that transit capital cost of those scores we'll have for you later on, but the total state assistance that was requested for those 3 projects was $34 million. In addition, and we spend a lot of time talking about transit capital because obviously it's a significant program, but at the same time, we've gone back and taken a hard look at all of our special funding programs and added new application processes so that we can go through and we can prioritize those requests in a manner that is similar to what we have done with the capital program. So just to give you a little snapshot, human service, this is transportation for seniors and for individuals living with disabilities. We have 40 applications requesting $6 million. That's primarily for replacement and expansion vehicles. In our demonstration program, and this has 2 components, new services and also innovation and technology. We have 12 applications requesting just less than $7 million. We're working with Cathy McGhee and her office on the innovation projects, and some of those projects may actually move over to the ITTF program. Technical assistance, this is for planning studies. We have 16 applications requesting $1.9 million. We also have a very successful transit internship program where we support transit agencies to hire interns. We have 7 applications for that program requesting $265,000. And I will add, we at DRPT have hired several of those interns to be part of our staff. So it is doing good things for the industry. I'm not really welcome in a lot of transit agencies because we're always looking for good staff. And then transportation demand management, we received 35 applications requesting just over $5 million. In terms of next steps, we do have some work that still needs to be done with the Department of Environmental Quality on electric bus applications. As I mentioned already, completing coordination with Cathy McGhee and her office on some demonstration projects, developing the funding recommendations, and bringing our draft 6-year program back to you in May for release and for presentation. That is a very quick transit capital update.
And we appreciate that. Any questions?
Any questions?
Jennifer?
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Jennifer, you have, in round numbers, I think $150 million or so funding request. How much money do you have to assist in meeting that?
That's a good question. Based on some preliminary calculations, we think we have in fiscal 21 numbers, the allocations, we have about $74 million. That doesn't account for any carryover from prior years. So we're still working through how the prioritization, I mean, obviously some of those projects we don't plan to recommend for funding, but we're working through that right now as we assess the bill. Steve's here, can keep me straight if I get my numbers wrong. So we're still working through that.
Okay, thank you.
Not near enough.
Okay, thank
All right,
you.
thank you.
We're going to try to do abbreviated versions of the next 2, and then we'll go right into our action meeting. Mr. Donahue. And what I will say, Mr. Donahue, we'll do a full presentation when we get back together. But it's so riveting. I hate for y'all to miss the full impact of this on the telephone, not being here.
Yes, we'll save it for everyone.
We'll save it.
Scale, Maury.
That's the second presentation.
Sorry. Madam Chair, members of the board, the presentation, I'm really just going to talk from basically the first slide, but it is kind of self-explanatory. It walks through the various major pieces of transportation legislation that were considered this session. As I do in all these presentations, I need to give you a caveat. Unless any discussion of the bill says it has been signed by the governor, it is not yet anything that we know will or will not become law or will become law in the form in which it is currently before the governor for his consideration. The session did adjourn. They went a few days into overtime to work on the budget and a few other items, but they did leave last Thursday, adjourned sine die. We are still reconvening on April 22nd as things currently stand for what's known as veto session. That is the day where, again, any amendments, vetoes, or other changes to bills from the governor would be considered by the assembly. And so again, if a bill does not, as you're going through this later, not now, but if a bill does not say signed by the governor, there is still consideration, that is possible from the executive branch on all this legislation. And again, I just really want to note that I think people often like to make assumptions when the General Assembly members go home that all changes to bills are over. And I just want to stress that is not always the case. And again, the governor always reserves his right to review a piece of legislation once the assembly's gone out. And moving forward there to create, again, a more sustainable transportation funding system, it also includes a new fee for fuel-efficient vehicles. They will, I want to stress, still have a discount and will not be penalized. I know there's still a lot of folks who remember the 2013 hybrid fee, where even when you bought gas, you paid a fee as if you bought no gas. That is not the case here. You would, again, just pay a certain amount relative to what the average car pays for gas. It also does include extending the regional gas tax, as we call it, to all parts of the state that do not currently have it. And then those funds go back to those district grant pots. And so again, for those of you who are not in, Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, along the 81 corridor, you will see some pretty significant increases in your district grant program funding, and that is outlined in these slides. I'm not going to go through it, but it's in there. And then there is a $10 cut in the vehicle registration fee. And again, the kind of concept behind this is that's a fee that is static. It does not grow much. It's only paid by Virginians, and then that revenue is replaced by the part of the gas tax increase, which 20% comes from out-of-state users. Another major piece of legislation was the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. That is the Richmond Regional Authority. If you're wondering which part of Central Virginia we're talking about there. This will raise a 0.7% retail sales tax, and then again the regional fuels tax would be imposed and go back to this authority. This authority is similar to Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. Again, it's established, it has its own independent decision-making authority. The revenues there, each authority has its own flow of revenues. In this one, 35% would remain with the authority for regional projects selected by the authority. 15% would go to GRTC for regional transit projects, and then 50% would go back to the local governments for projects that they select. There is a 50% maintenance of effort clause for transit. It is interestingly dated into the future, which is
how do they distribute the 50%? I'm sorry. How do they distribute the 50%?
Madam Chair, to Mr. Williams' question, the 50% that's returned to localities is done on a pro rata basis. So in Northern Virginia, 30% of the funding is returned back to jurisdictions. So it's based on whatever you generate. So basically, just to make this a simple thing, this is not exactly what happened. If there's $1, 50 cents of that dollars can go back to local governments. And if you're a jurisdiction and you're responsible for 10% of all revenues that are created, you'd get 10% of that 50 cents.
So they're going to actually calculate the revenues in Hanover, and that's how they're going to send it back to Hanover.
And that is done. We can do that for all the regional authorities. Yes, sir.
It's unfortunate they did that.
And so again, there's a maintenance of effort clause, a partial maintenance of effort clause that is future dated for transit there. In the Hampton Roads region, they did enact what's called the Hampton Roads Regional Transit Program. This includes a 6-cent increase per $100 of assessed value in the grantor's tax, which is a real estate transfer tax that is currently used in Northern Virginia within the Hampton Roads Transit District. And again, I want to stress that I'm not saying the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission. I'm saying the Hampton Roads Transit District. They are different. The district is fully contained within HR TAC, but every member of HR TAC is not a part of the transit district. So the transit district is really kind of those core communities there of Norfolk, Portsmouth, Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Newport News, and Hampton. Those funds are then managed by HR TAC, and their distribution must be approved by the authority. There's also a 1% hotel tax increase, again, in the transit district. And then there's a $20 million in state recreation taxes that is provided to this fund. That generates around $32 million a year. And I apologize, the Central Virginia Authority generates around $220 million a year when fully implemented. And then the last major piece of legislation was the Transportation Safety Bill. I'm disappointed to report that that failed the conference report on the Senate floor. It passed the House on a 54 or so to 45 vote. And then there was about 20 to 30 minutes of discussion on the Senate floor, and then the conference report failed 11 to 29 to pass. And at that point, it was pared down to two key priorities: primary seatbelt, which was the topic of discussion, and a second safety thing, which had both previously passed the House and Senate, but now is not before any bill before the governor, which was allowing local governments to reduce speed limits in residence districts and business districts below 25, but not below 15 miles per hour. I am pleased to report, though, that the handheld ban has passed both chambers and has been signed by the governor. I'll just go back to that. Is the only bill I'm talking about today that has actually been signed by the governor. So again, that one will become law, though it does have a delayed effective date of January 1, 2021. There's required education training for law enforcement and the general public prior to that taking place. And there is also a requirement that the various committee chairs work with the executive secretary of the Supreme Court to try and monitor citation data and other things to look at how that is working as it moves forward there. So just one quick additional slide on the statewide bill.
Can I say one thing about safety? Mm-hmm. The handheld ban did pass. So came through last year, it was for work zones. And so this year we made it comprehensive. So that part was really good. That was part of the omnibus. Getting seatbelts as a primary, 52% of all the people who die in Virginia are not wearing a seatbelt. We have more than 800 people die. 60% of teenagers are not wearing a seatbelt who are killed on Virginia's roads. But I will say this, that Senator Lucas and Delegate Jones did a magnificent job of really promoting primary seatbelt as well as the other safety measures in this bill. I just think we in transportation, we're fighting for this. We see the numbers, how important their leadership was, and they had a lot of courage, I think, in really trying to move this forward. The House did pass the seatbelt as a primary. It got to the Senate. It didn't pass, but it actually got to the floor of the Senate, which is as far as that bill has gotten. So anyway, I really just want to thank the leadership of Senator Lucas and Delegate Jones, and the fact that, you know, you begin to make a case for this, and for those of you on this board where this was really important, it was a tremendous effort to try to get this done.
Yeah, and also the advocates, AAA, Drive Smart, Chiefs of Police, other groups really worked hand in hand with us all through the session. And again, we were hopeful, but ultimately fell short, despite the great leadership.
Yeah, a remarkable collaborative effort. So thank you for pointing that out.
So I just want to hit 2 or 3 charts, and then I'm going to give you all the presentation to digest on your own. This first here is just the statewide.
Well, we're going to bring you back. We're going to do this was a lot of work. We're going to do a full presentation.
Yes, there are lots of homework assignments in the omnibus legislation for this body. So this is kind of just the highlights here and some of the other things. But here are the statewide revenues over this 6-year window. As you can see, it ramps up over time. Again, so in year 1, you have the registration fee reduction. We also eliminated the $5 walk-in fee at DMV. Today, if you renew your driver's license or registration at a DMV customer service center, you have to pay a $5 fee. That is eliminated by this legislation as well. But you can see kind of the net statewide revenues. We start at $73 million in this upcoming fiscal year, and it increases to around $450 million in the 6th year. And again, the important thing there is growth. Continued growth because of the way we've restructured the fuels tax. That bottom line you'll see there is what is kind of additive funds for the Smart Scale District Grant Program. And again, that is based on where money is generated and it goes to a particular district's district grant program. All districts do see some increase with the exception of Northern Virginia because it already, in the entire district, already has the regional fuels tax, which is going to a different infrastructure initiative in that area.
Can you go back one? The chart.
Charts on
This
my
is what the bill does, which to me is, this is how transportation, it doesn't matter if you all can read the whole thing, but that's how transportation is funded. And through this legislation, we are putting everything into a Commonwealth Transportation Fund. We are keeping every mode stable. No mode is hurt through this. All of them are stabilized and then tied to CPI and allowed to grow. So it is truly an investment in a multimodal transportation system.
It certainly is easier to understand.
Yeah, and it's transparent and it's open and you all can see how this is being allocated and distributed.
And so, Madam Chair, this is the last slide I intend to go over today. This shows you how the bulk of the new statewide money generated by the bill is allocated. Again, I want to remind everybody, there's $100+ million a year for smart scale. It's not shown here because that's from the regional fuels tax. There's $50 million in the omnibus legislation that goes to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. There's the separate Hampton Roads Transit program. There's the separate Central Virginia Transportation Authority. This is after maintenance, after the money to NVTA, excluding all of the regional taxes, some of which will come back to this body for allocation through smart scale. This is kind of how the remaining funds are distributed. Again, you see the special structures program, which I know the commissioner spent a lot of time working with you all on, is funded by this legislation. We have an increase in safety funding. We have ongoing increases in smart scale. And again, the smart scale money really ramps up over time. You guys tend to award money in the outer years, and so you're not going to see that in the front. There is an estimate in here for you all to look at later about what round 4 of smart scale will be. It's around $2 billion, which is a dramatic increase from what we had in round 3. Significant increases in transit funding. You also see significant increases in rail funding. Part of that is an actual increase in rail funding, and a different part of that, it was a policy decision that the General Assembly made. Since this body has been allocating priority transportation fund dollars to rail, they simply took that money out of the PTF and put it into the rail fund itself. And then again, you see also increases in port, aviation, space flight, and then also some additional funding with DMV to address their long-term solvency. The bill again did establish the Passenger Rail Authority, but we'll get into all of that in more detail at a later meeting. But just wanted to hit these 2 slides. There's 53 of these here for your reading pleasure. I think they're generally self-explanatory, but if you have any questions or other things, please feel free to give me a call or send an email, and we'd be happy to do our best to answer any questions. So, Madam Chair?
That's like this one question.
Mr. Dotson.
The 5 cents additional as of July 1st, and 5 cents on top of that, then
CPI.
Yes.
And the 7.5% is for the Richmond, Central Virginia area, additional to 5 cents. And the other 7.5% is for areas outside of Hampton Roads, Northern Virginia, 81 corridor. So it'd be like a 12.5% increase at January 1st. I mean, July.
Oh, I wish you would show that. Since you're asking the question, will you show the slide with the gas prices and the?
It's up.
Oh, there it is. How
Yeah,
did you know?
Madam Chair, Mr. Dotson, that is correct. In those areas, it would be more than 5 cents. It would be both the regional tax plus the 5 cents. But I did just want to, I guess, since we're going to have the discussion, wanted to show some information I pulled off of AAA's gas prices website yesterday. So there are a lot of folks who say, oh, well, the gas tax shows up cent for cent in the price of fuel. And I just want to walk through some examples since I know we're going to have this discussion in the coming months. In Virginia, the average price of fuel, according to AAA yesterday, was $2.06. Our weighted statewide gas tax, which includes the existing regional taxes, plus our 16.2 cents, is 22 cents. So let's look at other states and their gas taxes and what their price of fuel is. In Oklahoma, their gas tax is 2 cents less than Virginia. So again, if the tax was there cent for cent, then their price for fuel in Oklahoma should be $2.04. Well, it's not. It's $1.92. In Ohio, their gas tax is actually 16.5 cents higher than us. So gas in Ohio should be $2.20 some cents. It's actually $1.97. In Utah, their gas tax is only 9 cents higher than Virginia, so one would think, again, if gas taxes showed up cent for cent at the price of the pump, that it would be $2.15. Unfortunately for folks who live in Utah, it's $2.49. So it's not 9 cents higher, it's 43 cents higher. In Connecticut, their gas tax is 18 cents higher than it is in Virginia. So again, you would expect if the gas tax just showed up there as an additive onto the base of fuel price, that they would be $2.24. Again, unfortunately for folks in Connecticut, it's $2.49. So it's not 18 cents higher, it's 43 cents higher. In North Carolina, their gas tax is 14 cents higher per gallon, but the price of fuel is only a cent higher than it is here in Virginia. And I say all this not to say that I have any prediction as to what gas prices will or will not be in Virginia tomorrow, July 1 or December 1st, but merely to illustrate the point that Senator Saslaw has said to me for years, and now that we finally have these websites,
Yes, so many years.
I think we can see that there's a lot of validity in it, that there are many other factors that drive the price of gas, and often the gas taxes themselves do not show up at the pump in the same way as which they're applied at the wholesale level. Which is not to say they don't have an influence on price. I'm not here to say that either. All I'm here to say is that the influence is not a cent per cent increase when we look at the various prices across the state. And again, this is not a prediction of what prices may or may not be on July 1, what they might be on July 3rd, what they will be next week. I think we're entering a period of a whole host of factors that will have a greater impact on what the price of fuel is than whatever the tax may be in a given state.
Madam Secretary, Nick, you're saying as of July 1st, the areas outside of Hampton Roads, Virginia, the price of gas, or the gas taxes will be 34.5 cents a gallon?
Madam Chair, Mr. Dodson, no. In those places,
22 cents now.
That includes the weighted regional tax there. So in places without that,
It'll be
33.
It'll be 27 cents.
it will be 16.2 plus 5 plus the regional tax, which is 7.6. So 28.
The people ask me, so I want to be detailed.
Well, I think the important thing, though, also, Madam Chair, Mr. Dodson, is when folks ask that question, is to let them know that in North Carolina, where the gas tax is 14 cents higher, it only costs a penny more.
But then it does in West Virginia, too.
It's not a full indication of the price you're going to pay in the market.
Correct. Yeah, this is not remember the gas tax in Virginia is not like the sales tax when you buy a can of Coke and then there's 5.3% added to it. The gas tax in Virginia is collected at the wholesale level, or what we call the rack. There's less than 10 rack locations, if you will, and again, that's two portions removed from you actually purchasing it at the fuel. So there's the rack, which then sells to the distributor, who then actually sells it to the retail location, and that's where you purchase the fuel. And so there's many other factors that actually drive that price once it actually gets to us as consumers at that retail level. This is different than a sales tax, where it's just 5.3% of whatever you're paying. It's kind of an embedded factor in the overall price that happens several steps upstream from actual purchase.
I think too, the number you're using, the 22 cents here in Virginia, is a weighted average. It's weighted with the regions that have the 2.1, but the statewide average in your district is 16.2 cents.
Yes.
It is the third lowest in the United States. So we're at 16.2, Maryland's at 36, West Virginia's at 35, and North Carolina's at 36.
What's South Carolina? South Carolina's at what?
I believe they just recently did a staggered increase. So
Alabama just raised it 10 cents, tied it to the national highway construction cost. 21 states have raised the gas tax in recent years because we were all facing declining revenues. And so this is to try to build a bridge to whatever the next phase in transportation funding would be.
Well, it's a great time to do it with gas prices. Gas prices.
Anyway, Mr. Donahue, I really thank you. Any questions on the phone? We'll have a full briefing on this. But just great to work with you on this.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the board.
Quite a session, and here we are. Ms. Farmer. How are you?
I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. The Deputy Secretary was supposed to steal all the thunder, and with his abbreviated presentation, he did leave some for me, but I will still try to be as brief as possible this morning to make the best use of your time. So I'm going to talk to you about the assumptions that build upon our 6-year program and the 6-year financial plan that VDOT and its sister agencies will commence beginning that work as of today, now that session is complete and we can begin in earnest in development of materials for your consideration over the next couple of months. The state revenue updates we received in November were significantly higher in certain areas that impacted our overall assumptions. Again, those estimates were provided to us in November related to the current state of the economy and Department of Taxation's projections for the future. These assumptions also that I'm providing today in this slide are just about what those revenue estimate updates equated to. We were seeing sales tax on fuel decreasing over the time period of almost $150 million, retail sales up, and significant increases in motor vehicle sales and use taxes over the time period, with other updates included. For federal revenue, we're assuming 1.7% growth year over year after the current federal authorization expires at the end of September of this year. That's an area that we're watching very closely for development purposes and are very concerned about actions at the federal level. So to kick off our 6-year program development cycle, I want to point out that as the Deputy Secretary described, these 3 pieces of legislation have a significant impact on the assumptions going forward. This update represents this creation of the true Commonwealth Transportation Fund and a streamlined distribution of revenue that's available for us and our sister agencies. I even have to update this PowerPoint slide to add 2 more entities that will receive funds from the CTF in the future. So that allocation distribution over the 6 years we expect to represent $47.9 billion. This is an increase of $4.9 billion over what you saw last June. It includes the planned bond proceeds from the Garvey and CPR programs. That does not have a change from the prior year other than to drop the first year and add a 6th year. It represents transferring almost $5 billion to now 3 transportation regions. It dedicates $14 billion for maintenance and operations and just over about $15.5 billion for construction. So I'm just going to walk through these summary slides to provide a little bit of context about the increases and decreases over time. You'll see a combined Commonwealth Transportation Fund at the top. When we previously presented this information, it was the HMO and the TTF separately. We've combined that together. With the tax increases and reporting changes of different revenue streams over the 6 years compared to what you saw previously, it's about a $4.5 billion increase. Related to local and regional project participation, the decrease is really related to the first year of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project behind us, and we're moving forward with that project. So that's the main driver of that reduction. And then we have other miscellaneous updates and other revenue where unique revenue streams may have shifted to the CTF distribution for purposes of this schedule. In our bond area, the significant reduction in Route 58 just represents FY 2020 had some allocations, and that has been removed from this schedule. And then in the regional transportation funds, you see the significant increase. That represents all of those items that the Deputy Secretary mentioned previously in the creation of the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. With regard to allocations, I'll walk through this briefly. Debt service is trending as expected. Other agencies and transfers just represent some cleanup among other state agency details. For maintenance and operations, part of the governor's omnibus transportation package dedicated some funds to paving, and so for both VDOT and for city street payments, we're infusing some funding in the maintenance and operations area to help with that effort. In addition, that's just inherent program growth over time. The conference report has some actions for state employees as well as other actions that affect VDOT costs, and so that's part of the maintenance and operations program. Our tolling effort is just inherent growth. I will jump down to special structures. That's 6-year total of $372 million is what we expect to set aside for special structures in accordance with the legislation. You see the increases in rail and public transportation. And our sister agencies, the ports, airports, and spaceflight will all receive increases over what they have currently assumed based on the distribution of the CTF. DMV is now a component of the CTF distribution. That is new with the change in the legislation. They were not part of our distribution before. We bring in the fuel tax revenue that was allocated to them previously, plus some additional increases supported by the legislation. And the lower part of the slide highlights the regional taxes and the impact and the increases over time. The remainder of my presentation highlights areas of the construction program and how they change with the legislation. I can go through those or leave that as homework if you'd like to walk through and let us know if you have any questions. Whatever your preference, Madam Chair.
Any questions?
Okay, just a flip to the end, and I will accept any questions you all have as you look through this information. We'll begin development beginning today of our 6-year improvement program that will be presented to you in May. We'll also be updating the assumptions for I-81 based on the debt authorization as well as the revenue update. We did see some significant changes in the statewide revenue streams for interstates that we'll be implementing. As I mentioned before, we'll continue to monitor federal activity, and you also see draft budgets for the CTF as well as for VDOT and DRPT in May. Any questions?
Thank you, and we will bring you back as well.
Okay.
You know, as we go through the development of the 6-year improvement plan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I believe these were all the presentations we needed to at least bring forward so that we can have votes in the future, and with Jennifer DeBruhl making sure people knew what the transit capital applications were. And so there really was a deliberate decision to make this as short as possible. We're gonna adjourn. And all right, so I am adjourning the workshop. I am going to open with the action meeting. And so Carol, would you mind explaining what people, is there anyone here today who wishes to address the board? So, but with that, will you remind people who may be streaming what they can do if they do have a public comment?
On the agendas, it was posted if you had a public comment, you could send it to my email address, which is carol.mathis@vdot.virginia.gov.
So citizens are all welcome to provide written comments to us to be a part of the official record. Do I have a motion on the minutes?
Second.
Any further discussion?
We have to do a roll call.
No further discussion. Okay, we have to do a roll call in an electronic meeting. So Carol's going to go through, and if you all will just say aye or nay. Go ahead.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
Mr. Miller.
Aye.
Mr. Stinson.
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Malbin.
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth.
Aye.
Mr. Williams.
Aye.
Ms. Hines.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Dodson.
Aye.
Dr. Smoot.
Aye.
We have to do that every time. Every action, we have to do a roll
Okay.
call. Rick is stopping me. I'm sorry, Rick. Mr. Yates made the motion and Mr. Tunk seconded it. Okay.
Okay. Mr. Dudley.
adopt the minutes.
We made a motion, we had a second. Everybody said aye, so
Yes.
they're adopted.
Okay.
Just because they moved it second, that's not the vote that needs to vote.
Yeah, but they did, that was the roll call.
That was a roll call. They need to vote on it.
Mr. Yates.
Approving the minutes.
Okay.
We need a motion second,
make
but
a
we
motion,
didn't ask,
still
we
vote
didn't
against
call the
your
motion.
Mr. Tonk.
Do it many times.
Okay, now are we done? Are we good? Yes. Okay, but I'm sorry, I thought you did all right. Okay. Mr. Dudley.
Good afternoon, Madam Secretary. Members of the board, I have 3 items for your consideration today. The first is a request for $250,000 in recreational access allocation from Pittsylvania County in the Lynchburg District for a new access road to the Pittsylvania County Wayside Park. The recreational facility currently does not have adequate access to a public street. The county is making numerous improvements to the Wayside Park and expects an increased volume of visitors, which will necessitate a new access to the park. The access road is proposed to be a 20-foot wide asphalt roadway with direct access to Business Route 29. VDOT will administer the project for the county and has provided the estimate and has obtained concurrence from a district board member, Mr. Dotson. We recommend approval of the $250,000 of recreational access funds unmatched to the county.
Mr. Dotson.
Yes, Madam Secretary, for the reason I came today is that this is a project, over $1 million project altogether by the county of Pennsylvania. They put around $150,000 thus far. They've been going for a couple of years. There's very little recreation activities in the northern part of Pennsylvania County. It's right across the river from Vista, and they have a road that's up to 12 feet wide and causes a lot of issues as far as getting access. And I visited the site a couple weeks ago with a local district engineer, and this afternoon it was like a dozen kids out there playing, right after school. So I think what happens is going to be wonderful for Pennsylvania County, and I move for the adoption of the request.
Madam Chairwoman?
Yes.
Madam Chairwoman?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson is very hard to hear. Can you ask him to speak directly to the mic?
He said, please vote for this.
Yeah, just please.
I understand.
So, Mr. Miller
He's
is
talking to the mic.
Mr. Miller, is that a second?
Second.
Okay.
Thank you.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, go ahead. Carol's got a call. I got it. Does she really? If you know.
You have to roll call.
Okay.
Dr. Smoot?
You got a roll call.
Doing it.
Dr. Smoot?
Yeah.
Mr. Dodson?
Yes.
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
Ms. Hines?
Yes.
Mr. Yates?
Yes.
Mr. Williams?
Yes.
Mr. Whitworth?
Yes.
Mr. Tunk?
Yes.
Mr. Malvin? Mr. Kasprowitz?
Yes, on you now.
Mr. Stinson?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
No. I mean, yes, I'm through. I understand.
Mr. Rucker?
Yes.
Mr. Malvin?
He said yes.
Yes.
Okay. That's everyone.
How about here?
I got this.
I will meet you.
Okay.
I vote yes.
Thank you.
Thank
Madam
you.
Secretary. Appreciate it.
Yes. Mr. Dudley?
Yes, ma'am. My next 2 items are both revenue sharing allocations. The first reallocation is for the City of Roanoke. The City of Roanoke is requesting that the Hollins Road Orange Avenue intersection improvements project, which is currently in the 6-year plan, be designated as a revenue sharing project and have surplus funds from a completed revenue sharing project in the city in the amount of $500,000 be transferred to it so the project can be awarded. You might recall that the Hollins Road Orange project was one of the projects presented to the board last month as an at-risk smart scale project. It was advertised twice and both times the bids came in over budget. Because the Hollins Road Orange Avenue project is not a current revenue sharing project, the entire board must approve the transfer. The Salem District has obtained concurrence from our Salem District CTB member, Dr. Smoot, and we recommend approval of the revenue sharing reallocation in the amount of $500,000 with $500,000 of local match.
Mr. Smoot.
Madam Chair, I move approval, and I also want to say that this project has become even more significant through a coincidence of events which have led to the local government of the Roanoke Valley being unable to reach agreement with Norfolk Southern to continue their trash train operation. So this intersection is now going to see an additional 50 or so large trucks per day hauling trash to the landfill.
Thank you, Mr. Smoot. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
All those in favor? Carol. Mr. Rucker.
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
Mr. Stinson.
Yes.
Mr. Kasprowitz. Mr. Malbin.
Yes.
Mr. Tunk.
Yes.
Mr. Whitworth.
Yes.
Mr. Williams.
Yes.
Mr. Yates.
Yes.
Ms. Hines.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Mr. Dodson.
Yes.
Dr. Smoot.
Yes.
Mr. Kasprowitz.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Dudley.
Thank you very much. The second revenue sharing reallocation is for the city of Stanton. The city is requesting that the Central Avenue Streetscape project, which is also a transportation project in the 6-year plan, be designated as be designated as a revenue sharing project and have $57,216 in surplus funds from a completed revenue sharing project transferred to it so we can have the project re-advertised. The project was originally advertised in September, and a single contractor provided a bid of almost $1 million over the budgeted amount. The bid documents, scope, and design were modified in an effort to reduce the cost, but the new engineer's estimate is still slightly over the budget.
I'm sorry. Mr. Whitworth.
I so move. Second.
All those in favor? Oh, no.
Can you just
Well, in this section.
in the section or writ large?
In this section. So, all right, Mr. Whitworth. We have a first. We have a second.
I didn't hear a second. Was there a second?
Yes, second is by me.
Okay.
Okay. Dr. Smoot.
Yes.
Mr. Dodson.
Yes.
Mr. Johnson.
Yes.
Ms. Hines. Mr. Yates.
Yes.
Mr. Williams.
Yes.
Mr. Whitworth.
Yes.
Mr. Tunk.
Yes.
Mr. Malbin.
Yes.
Mr. Kasprowitz.
Yes.
Mr. Stinson.
Yes.
Mr. Miller.
Yes.
Mr. Rucker.
Aye.
Ms. Hines.
Aye.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you
Mr.
very much.
Dudley. Ms. Keene. Unless there's an objection, we will do items 4 and 5 together. We'll put them in a block and vote only one time.
Okay, no objections?
Please.
Whew, okay.
So I have 2 actions items for you all this afternoon. First is the location approval for the North Star Boulevard. Mr. Zeller briefed you at workshop last month regarding North Star Boulevard. The new roadway will consist of a 4-lane divided curb and gutter typical section. It's located in Loudoun County. The location and design public hearing was held July 8th, 2019. In September of 2019, the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors endorsed the location. The total cost is $90 million, and I am recommending approval by the CTB for the location of North Star Boulevard.
Okay, that was North Star, and now we'll do the number 5.
Yes, the second one is the location approval for Nash Road Extension in Chesterfield County. The new roadway will provide 2 12-foot lanes with 10-foot wide shoulders, 8-foot paved on each side. A meeting to meet the location hearing requirements was held May 21st, 2018 at the Community Center. The comments from the meeting had very much of a split decision. Follow-up meetings were held with the Deerfield community, which were the majority of the comments were raised, and a alternative alignment was agreed to at that meeting. So there was a revised alignment based on the outcome of the meeting with the Deerfield community residents. The total estimated cost is $30 million, and I'm recommending approval by the CTB for the location of Route 636 or Nash Road in Chesterfield County.
Do I have a motion on both?
I'd move that we adopt.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Dr. Smoot?
Aye.
Mr. Dodson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Ms. Hines?
Aye.
Mr. Yates?
Aye.
Mr. Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth?
Aye.
Ms. DeTunk?
Aye.
Mr. Malvin?
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz?
Aye.
Mr. Stinson?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Walton?
Good afternoon. The United States Army is planning the expansion of Arlington National Cemetery, expanding it about 65 acres. It will require the realignment of several roads that are under the jurisdiction of the Department of Transportation. They are in the process now of doing both the design of the roadway, new roadway network, as well as the cemetery expansion. Eastern Federal Lands will be administering the Defense Access Road project. They are hoping to get that underway the end of this year, beginning of next year. There's certain design work that they've asked us to review. So what you have before you is an agreement between VDOT and the Army, which they will pay us to do the review of the work that's going to be undertaken later on this year, and I'd ask for your support.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor, Carol's calling the roll.
Mr. Rucker?
Aye.
Mr. Miller?
Aye.
Mr. Stinson?
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz?
Aye.
Mr. Malvin?
Aye.
Ms. DeTunk?
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth?
Aye.
Mr. Williams?
Aye.
Mr. Yates?
Aye.
Ms. Hines?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Dodson?
Aye.
Dr. Smoot?
Aye.
That's everyone. Okay, thank you, Mr.
And,
Walton.
Madam Secretary, on a good note, for all you who are Irish or Irish for today, Aaron go Bravo.
Ms. Pryor, we're going to take the next 3 in a block unless I have an objection from anybody. Okay.
Okay, the first item I have for you is the addition of one project to the 6-year program. It's related to the agreement that Mr. Walton just...
I think we can hear. Can't hear.
The first item...
Okay, we're going to try it again. Ms. Pryor.
The first item I have is the addition of one project to the 6-year program. It is a project related to the agreement that Mr. Walton just presented to you for VDOT staff time to provide oversight for the work at Arlington National Cemetery, and I recommend your approval when we take the vote.
Okay. Number 8.
The second item is my normal monthly transfers, and I recommend your approval of those as well. Finally, The final action is related to the Smart Scale at-risk briefing that I presented last month for the Route 122 at Route 636 intersection in Franklin County. It is a budget increase, and the recommendation is to approve the budget increase with funding from the district grant fund. And I recommend your approval of all 3 items.
Mr. Smoot, I'm going to ask you to make the motion. Are you there?
I move that we
Okay.
adopt all 3
That's what we're doing.
of the recommendations.
Okay. Okay, second. All those in favor? Oh, any further discussion on these? Okay. Carol?
Dr. Smoot,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Yates, Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Ms. DeTunk,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
Okay, thank you. Mr. DeBruhl?
Back again. Item number 10 on your agenda is action on the addition of a public transportation project to our 6-year improvement program. This is specifically targeted at pandemic response and mitigation for the transit agencies that receive operating assistance from the Commonwealth. What this will do is will allow us to take $11 million out of prior year deobligated funding from completed and closed projects in our capital program and put that funding through our operating formula to provide assistance to our transit agencies to help offset the additional costs that they've seen from responding to the pandemic and the loss of ridership and revenue that they'll see as a continued result of this. So what this will do is it'll allow us to push funding out in early April to help those transit agencies with that response and mitigation. This does not include any funding for Washington Metro. That issue is much more significant and one that's going to require a regional solution in the future. So with that, I would recommend your approval of the resolution.
Move approval.
Second.
Second.
I will just say, I think this is a really great idea, and I thank you all, Director Mitchell, for doing this. I know there'll be a press release going out today, but this is important. Any other comments or questions? Okay, all those in favor?
Mr. Rucker,
Aye.
Mr. Miller,
Aye.
Mr. Stinson,
Aye.
Mr. Kasprowitz,
Aye.
Mr. Malbin,
Aye.
Ms. DeTunk,
Aye.
Mr. Whitworth,
Aye.
Mr. Williams,
Aye.
Mr. Yates,
Aye.
Ms. Hines,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Mr. Dodson,
Aye.
Dr. Smoot,
Aye.
Okay, we made it through the agenda. For everyone who is here today, I just again thank you. I wish you a very happy St. Patrick's Day. I will say to you that we're living in an unbelievable time right now. And it's hard to wrap your mind around it, but I do want you to know that everyone here is working diligently on this issue, and we will get through it. And I really look forward to the time when we have our CTB dinner and we can once again toast the work that's being done here. But until that happens, and when it happens, we'll celebrate. But until that moment, I do want you to know I'm very, very grateful for the work of this board. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All of you.
Be well.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Don't stop breathing into the mic.
Julie.
I still see green.